Friends, thanks for joining us in the E2 podcast today. We welcome back Ken Idleman, Vice President of Leadership Development for the Solomon Foundation. And today, in this second part of two parts, Ken is going to be speaking about the devotion of leaders. The devotion of leaders. Our thanks also to CDF Capital for their investment in elders. It is their investment that makes this podcast possible.
Hey everyone, welcome to the E2 Effective Elders podcast. E2 is devoted to coaching your elder team to win by providing biblical and practical resources in authentic relationships. E2 wants nothing more than to equip you to move God's kingdom forward in the place you're serving Jesus. Visit us at e2elders.org and please share this good word with others.
Hey, we are grateful to welcome you back to E2's podcast. This is part two of a two-part series featuring Ken Idleman, the Vice President of the Solomon Foundation when it comes to leadership development. And Ken was with us just a few days ago talking about developing leaders. Ken, welcome back for part two of your wisdom to us. So please speak into our lives on this very important issue of refilling that leadership pipeline.
Well, thank you, Gary. I'm delighted to be back with you. And I recently read an article in the Christian Standard by Tyler McKenzie that I think should be required reading for every elder and every pastoral leader.
The June issue.
Yes. He talks about the importance of restoring to the contemporary church the devotion that characterized the leaders of the first century church. And it wasn't just the apostles' teaching and fellowship, breaking of bread and prayers that was important in Acts 2:42, but the line, they devoted themselves. And that devotion needs to be what we're seeing in the contemporary leaders of the church. And I think the best model for that kind of leadership is Jesus himself. And I did a study a while back on this.
And about the word development. So we're from a couple of days ago, we're developing leaders. Now we're talking about these leaders need to be devoted. They're
right.
A deep devotion. Good.
Yes.
Okay.
And so the devotion, I think, is modeled in Jesus. And the way he worked with and shaped the disciples, and the model that provided for the larger community. And so I think that the devotion that we draw bead on is modeled in Jesus, even more so than in the apostles in the book of Acts. I think Jesus in the Gospels for elders and pastoral leaders needs to be the model. And several things I see in him, and Gary, you feel free to interrupt me at any point because your editorial additions are really good. And so I'm anxious to hear what it may prompt in you as we move through these. But first of all, Jesus put the needs of his followers first. And so in Jesus, you don't see a leader who is motivated by a self-serving agenda or by manipulation or by domination, and rather Jesus was constantly aware of the needs of the people that he met as he went about doing good. And I think that is a fundamental ethic, that we understand that our role in church leadership is to benefit those who are followers of Christ that are under our charge. They are our sheep. They are the people that we need to be serving, and we put their needs ahead of our own. Leadership is not something that we do for us. It is something we do for them. It's an extremely unselfish thing to answer the call to lead.
Yeah.
Whether it's President of the United States or the local church.
Yeah. Mark chapter 10, verse 45. Jesus said, Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. It's got to be our heart, others before ourselves. Mm-hmm.
Yes. And secondly, I think Jesus reproduced his values and he released his authority to his disciples. He empowered them to live dynamically, and then he decentralized his leadership. He did not want his followers to be totally dependent on him, but ultimately he wanted them to be able to be interdependent on one another in the life of the church. And because Jesus was going to go away after 3 years, and there needed to be a release of authority. And you see it in Mark chapter 3, verse 14. It says, he appointed the 12, designating them apostles that they might be with him, and that he might send them out to preach and have authority. So Jesus equipped them, he reproduced his values in them, and then he released his authority to them.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something that as leaders we need to do, to not be the final answer on every issue, not to be the authority, but to distribute that authority, that leadership
authority. I do
authority.
believe that we struggle with that. I believe that we who are older struggle with handing off a baton of leadership to those who are younger.
Yeah.
And we need to become all the more devoted to delegating authority and responsibility to those who are younger. Acts chapter 6, the feeding of the Greek-speaking widows, when the apostles could not keep up with the growth of the church and their responsibilities, the 7 men selected, known to be full of the Holy Spirit and wisdom. Verse 6, they lay hands on them and pray. That laying on of hands was for the giving of authority. So not only did they say, go out and feed these widows, but we give you the authority to do so. We have to be devoted to that.
And think about the fact that Jesus, as the Son of God, is sending these men out 2 by 2 to represent him and to represent the kingdom of heaven, the teaching of the kingdom of heaven. And even though he gave them very detailed instructions as they went, that's a very daring thing to release your authority. And if Jesus can do it, here's my point, we can do it.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
And you've got to understand that sometimes the people to whom you release that authority, that leadership, are going to blow it. They're going to stub their toe, but it becomes a learning experience for them. It's part of the training. It's part of what Jesus had to deal with when he sent out the 12. Also, I think Jesus was accountable to those he led. I don't think we think about that very much, that Jesus had an accountability to the people that he led, but he came to seek and save that which was lost, came not to be served, but to serve. And I think in Jesus we see that accountability to people. I think you see it in the Apostle Paul. He said in Romans 1 that I am obligated to the wise and the unwise, to the Greeks and the non-Greeks. And there's that sense of obligation, that sense of accountability. We dare not lose that. We tend to want to lead because we want people to be accountable to us, but that's backwards.
Right.
We have an accountability to them, and that's what teaches them to be accountable to other leadership.
Corinthians, Paul said, chapter 4, verse 2, he said, now it is required that those who have been given a trust must prove faithful. And we have been given a trust. It's called the bride. And we're going to be held accountable. We've got to be faithful to the trust that we have been given. And that, again, speaks to devotion. There's got to be a devotion. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Another thing I think we see in Jesus, too, is that he demonstrated his servant leadership in his compassion. Mm-hmm. And again, today, compassion can be seen as perceived to be weakness. Mm-hmm. And yet in Jesus, that compassion how many times in Luke's gospel does it say, and Jesus, being moved with compassion, said something or did something?
Mm-hmm.
And while compassion may not be on the checklist in that specific word in 1 Timothy chapter 3 or Titus chapter 1, I think we see that in the servant leadership of Jesus, that compassion for others, what his heart felt, his hand touched. He was constantly on the lookout for people who were in need,
Mm-hmm.
and he met them at their point of need.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the kind of compassion that we need to see in church leadership today. And another thing Jesus did was he had the ability to spot potential in
Yes.
people and develop that potential. And there could not have been a more diverse group than the apostles, where you have a Peter and a Thomas,
Mm-hmm.
polar opposites. You've got
Yep.
you got Judas Iscariot and Matthew, who collected taxes for from
Roman
the Jews for the
authorities.
Romans.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And Jesus took this very diverse group and molded them together into a band of brothers. And that kind of leadership, spotting leadership in people,
Mm-hmm.
other people, and developing that potential. In the sporting world, it would be Phil Jackson with the Chicago Bulls, 6 national titles,
Mm-hmm.
legendary Chicago Bulls team, had the most diverse personalities: Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, Steve Greer, Dennis Rodman.
Mm-hmm.
King-size egos. That group should have splintered off in several different directions, but instead they really played ball together, and their success is legendary in the NBA.
Mm-hmm.
And Phil Jackson had a capacity to spot talent, capability, potential in players, and then develop it and into a team.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of leadership is vital. I think we see it in Jesus. I think we need to see more of it in the life of the church. I think also I noted that Jesus led by persuasive teaching and example, rather than by commanding and controlling. You see that Jesus is an encourager. He never used coercion, never used threats of punishment or reprisal. He said after he returned to the Father, he would send the Holy Spirit as a comforter, a strengthener, to empower and equip his followers to accomplish the commission. And in Jesus, we see this kind of patient teaching and this consistent example.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for church leaders, elders, pastors, there needs to be this patient teaching.
Yes.
And not a commanding, controlling attitude. We're not drovers on horseback with bullwhips. We're kind shepherds leading with staffs out front.
Right. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And I think finally, I would say that Jesus demonstrated his leadership in his humility.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was the outstanding trait in the life of Jesus. He was born in Bethlehem.
Yes.
Born of a virgin, born of a woman. Bethlehem is a city we wouldn't even know about today, a town we wouldn't know about today if he had not been born there. So he began in Bethlehem in a manger. The way he lived his life, his death on a cross between 2 thieves, the humility of Jesus.
Yeah.
Philippians chapter 2.
Yes.
He made himself of no reputation, took the form of a servant, suffered death, even death on a cross.
Mm-hmm.
So the humility of Jesus just stands out. And I think you see it in other apostolic leaders, because in the case of the Apostle Paul said, I would be willing to be accursed from Christ for the sake of my brothers.
Mm-hmm.
that is one puzzling statement to me in the New Testament, and it's my amazement at Paul's compassion and humility.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, here's a man, a Pharisee of the Pharisees. He had credentials. He was somebody special, and he was climbing the ladder. And he had his eyes closed and opened on the Damascus Road at the same time. Mm-hmm. Completely inverted his value system, and he becomes this humble man who is shipwrecked and beaten with rods and stoned and cast out of cities, and that humility that you see in him, and Epaphroditus in Philippians chapter 2 he's distressed because the Philippian Christians heard that he was ill. That's how humble he was. He was not concerned about his own health. He wasn't distressed because he was ill. He wasn't distressed because he was ill and didn't get enough attention. He was distressed because they heard that he was ill, and he didn't want them being concerned about him. He wanted their concern to be focused in other places. So you got Paul, you got Epaphroditus, you got Timothy. Epaphroditus ill to the point of death. You got Timothy. These guys all have this humility that's just compelling and refreshing. And in our day and age, when there's so much jockeying for position and prominence and
right, and we look at our culture today, and we look at the award shows. Literally thousands of awards given over the course of 12 months. When we look at the different titles, the positions of authority, the emphasis that is placed on money and the things that money can buy, humility is not a part of the fabric of our culture. When you were
you mentioned the award shows, Gary. That is just something that is out of control. We've got the Golden Globes, we've got the Oscars, we've got the People's Choice, we've all this self-congratulatory stuff, and you can tell that the people that attend those things, unless they get the award and go up on the stage, they're bored with the whole thing. They're not impressed with their own importance, and heart of hearts, they know better.
Even when we look historically, it all started with the Oscars, and it wasn't shortly after the Oscars, but all of these many different award shows started. Similarly, Life magazine started many decades ago, and then Life magazine was a standalone, and then we had magazines develop, People, etc., and we now even have a magazine called Self.
Self, yeah.
So the key is, how do we take the focus off from self and put it onto others? And that requires humility. When you mentioned Philippians 2, I thought of that text where it says, and he humbled himself and he became obedient to death, even death on a cross. He humbled himself, and that word means to go to a lower place. And Jesus literally did that. And to me, I believe it's a conscious decision for all of us with the dawn of every day that we make a decision. How can I humble myself as a servant of Jesus before others? And, you hit the nail on the head, Ken, when you said, this is a devotion, that we devote ourselves to living and leading like Jesus. And you've articulated them so very well, many talking points of what it looks like to live and lead like Jesus. So I thank you for that very much.
But the humility is, it says, humble yourself. Nobody can humble you but you.
Right, yes.
Sometimes life circumstances have the potential to humble us, but there are some people who stiffen their backs and they're gonna put their heads down and get through it by their own craft or design or their own abilities. Nobody can humble you but you, and the same sun that melts wax hardens clay. There's some people who will refuse to be humbled, but it's much better to humble ourselves.
That's a powerful metaphor, buddy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, Ken, we're wrapping up here. Thank you so very much for being a friend of E2. Thank you for being a friend of mine, and I look forward to getting connected with you soon after COVID is, and we're on the other side of COVID.
Good.
You are a real you're a Barnabas, buddy.
Thank you, Gary. Likewise, brother. Right back at you.
Well, appreciate it so very much. God bless you.
Thank you. Thank you, Gary.